1. The Expedition. Perhaps no other part of the North American wilderness was so difficult to conquer as the area along the Hudson River to the Canadian border. Thick green forests, with every kind of tree, animal, and bird, covered the entire region. Numerous lakes and hundreds of rivers and streams formed a labyrinth. Tall waterfalls, high cliffs, and hidden caves completed the natural landscape. Snowy winters and hot, humid summers were the typical climate. It was difficult for the early colonists to settle in this area. It was even more difficult for soldiers to fight a war here. Only the Indians of the different tribes moved quickly and safely in this region. It had been their home for centuries. In 1754, the French and Indian War began in this region. In July 1757, Fort Henry was a small Anglo-American fort under the command of General Monroe. General Monroe's Indian scouts had reported to him that the enemy, the French and the Huron Indians, was numerous. Therefore, he asked General Webb, commander of the larger Fort Edward, to send him more soldiers. General Webb immediately sent a group of soldiers to General Monroe. General Webb then asked young Major Hayward to accompany General Monroe's 2 daughters to see their father. Cora Monroe, a beautiful young woman with dark hair and dark eyes, was the oldest. Alice Monroe, a delicate adolescent with fair hair and blue eyes, was the youngest. Major Hayward's Indian guide, Magua, led the expedition through the forest. Magua was a tall young Indian. His strong, muscular body moved like that of a cat, lightly, silently, and quickly. Magua walked ahead, following a secret path, while the others followed close behind. Alice and Cora rode 2 Narragansett horses. These horses were the most secure for riding in rough country and in forests. Magua moved with ease through the dense vegetation. Shortly after leaving Fort Edward, the group met a young white man who was also going to Fort Henry. He was a preacher and a singing teacher of religious hymns. He carried a prayer book and a pipe with him. His name was David Gamut. As they crossed the forest, Alice Monroe said to Major Hayward,
"I don't trust the eyes of the Indian guide Magua."
Major Hayward replied,
"Magua is a friend. He is the only one who knows the secret way through this dangerous forest."
"I still don't like his eyes,"
Alice insisted. 2. Hawkeye and the Mohicans. That afternoon, after having traveled for many miles, Magua stopped and said,
"I can't go on. I've lost the way."
"What do you mean, Magua?"
Major Hayward asked, very perplexed. Magua's cold eyes looked at Major Hayward, but he didn't speak.
"Are we lost? What can we possibly do at this late hour? Who can we ask for help?"
Major Hayward said, looking very worried. Suddenly he heard a noise in the forest. It was the noise of footsteps. 3 men walked out of the dark forest into a small grassy area. One of them was an American frontier scout called Hawkeye. He wore the typical clothes of the scout, a green hunting shirt, a summer cap of animal skins, buckskin pants, and Indian moccasins. In his belt he had a hunting knife, a pouch, and a powder horn. He carried a long hunting rifle. The other 2 men were Mohican Indians, the old chief Chingachgook, and his handsome son, Uncas. They were good friends of Hawkeye. The 2 Mohicans had joined the Anglo-American forces at the start of the French and Indian War in 1754, They wanted to fight their old enemies, the French and the Huron Indians. The two Mohicans, father and son, were the last survivors of their tribe. The Mohicans had been one of the greatest and strongest tribes of North America. After years of wars, illness, and white settlement, thousands of Mohicans died. Chingachgook and Uncas were the last pure-blooded Mohicans. Major Hayward was glad to see an American frontier scout. He immediately told Hawkeye that they were lost and that they wanted to go to Fort Henry. The scout was surprised and said,
It would be easier for you to go to Fort Edward. It's closer.
What? Closer?
Exclaimed Major Hayward.
But we left Fort Edward this morning with our Indian guide.
You have an Indian guide who got lost in the forest? How strange,
Hawkeye said, shaking his head.
Indians here know every deer path and every stream of the forest. What tribe does your guide belong to?
He is a Huron.
Major Hayward replied.
Your guide is a Huron? But the Hurons are our enemy. They cannot be trusted.
Our guide Magua was born farther north in Huron country, but later he was adopted by the Mohawks. He is now a Mohawk and serves with our armies as a friend and guide.
No, he's a Huron by birth. They are a dangerous race. They steal, they kill. You can never trust them. He was probably leading you into a deadly trap right here in the forest. The Delawares and the Mohicans are the only honest tribes that you can trust. They have been great warriors for centuries,
said Hawkeye.
It is getting dark, and we need to find our way to Fort Henry. This is dangerous territory. Can you lead us, Hawkeye?
Major Hayward asked.
Yes, I can lead you to Fort Henry, but first we must capture your Huron guide, Magua, and make him a prisoner. Listen to my plan. You talk to him while my friends Chingachgook and Uncas grab him from behind.
Major Hayward walked over to Magua and began talking to him. Magua, however, heard noises behind him and quickly escaped before the Mohicans could capture him. 3. In the cave. Magua escaped into the forest and was nowhere to be found. It was almost nightfall. At this northern latitude of 42 degrees, the night follows the day very quickly. Hawkeye and the two Mohicans would accompany the group to Fort Henry early the next morning.
We must find a place for the night that's safe and well hidden. The trip to Fort Henry is a long one, and there are enemy Indians everywhere,
Hawkeye said.
If I remember correctly, there's a secret hiding place nearby. We must move silently, and you must promise to keep this hiding place a secret.
Everyone agreed, and Hawkeye led them to the river. They left their horses behind and got into a canoe at the riverbank. They went up the river to a small island near a tall waterfall. Behind the noisy waterfall there was a cave, which was their hiding place for the night. There were waterfalls on both sides of the cave. It was time for the evening meal. Everyone was tired and hungry, but very thankful for a safe resting place. Uncas, the young Mohican, served the meal of venison and water to the two sisters. This attention to the girls was unusual, because Mohican warriors never serve women. Uncas sat next to Cora. His eyes smiled at her. He spoke a few words of English, and she was happy to talk to him. They were able to understand each other, and they enjoyed being together. Major Hayward ate his meal next to Alice. They talked about a lot of things and laughed together. Major Hayward liked Alice and her gentle, innocent ways. After the small meal, David Gammett, the preacher, opened his hymn book and began to play his pipe. Alice and Cora sang some church hymns, while everyone listened sleepily. 4. The Huron Attack. Hawkeye and the Mohicans kept watch while the others slept. Their sleep was interrupted in the middle of the night by the screaming of the horses. There were wolves nearby, and they were howling loudly. But suddenly the howling stopped. Hawkeye was worried and said,
"The Huron Indians are in the area. They know where we are. The ladies can rest a little longer, but we must be ready to leave the cave before dawn."
Cora and Alice looked at each other helplessly. Cora said,
If only we had not asked to visit our father at Fort Henry. We have put the lives of these men in danger. I feel responsible.
Major Hayward replied,
No, Cora. You are not responsible for this. We are soldiers, and there is a war. It is our duty to accompany you safely to your father.
Just before dawn, as the group was getting ready to leave, the Hurons attacked them from the riverbank. The screams and shouts of the Hurons were wild and frightening. Major Hayward and the other men fought bravely. David Gamut was wounded. With the first morning light, Hawkeye saw that 4 Hurons had swum to the island. He and Uncas shot 2 of them. The other 2 reached the island, and Hawkeye and Major Hayward fought hand-to-hand with them. Hawkeye killed 1 Huron, and Major Hayward had a terrible fight with the other. Hayward was almost thrown off a cliff, but Uncas saved his life. Major Hayward looked at Uncas with gratitude and respect. Then he said,
Uncas, you have saved my life, and I will never forget this. I have a debt with you, my friend.
Uncas offered his hand to Major Hayward. They shook hands and exchanged looks of friendship and understanding. Hawkeye smiled and said,
Uncas has already saved my life 5 times.
Exercise 4. Listen carefully to this conversation between General Monroe and Hawkeye. As you listen, fill in the blanks on the map, and then answer the questions.
Hawkeye, I urgently need you for a very important expedition. You must leave at once, and tell no one. I'm ready to go, General. When you leave Fort Henry, go east along Beaver Path. Then climb the Blue Hills and proceed east to Chief Sitting Turtle's camp. Here you will give the chief the secret map of the Huron villages in our area. When you have done this, go south, following Tomahawk Stream, all the way to Silver Lake. Here you will meet David Brown, the fort's doctor. Please take him south to Fort Edward. At Fort Edward, Major Cooper, who is Major Hayward's cousin, will give you a box of new rifles and a fast horse. Go west to Pine Point. Leave your horse at Pine Point, put the rifles in the canoe, and go southeast to Rock Island. Here you will find a big box of ammunition. Take it. With your canoe, go north up the Hudson River until you reach Arrow Creek. Our Indian scout, Running Wolf, will meet you there. Give him the box of rifles, and then proceed north to Fort Henry with the ammunition. You have 3 days' time.
5. Le Renard. The fighting went on for some time. The war cries of the Hurons filled the air. Hawkeye shot several Hurons with his long hunting rifle. The Indians called his rifle La Longue Carabine because it never missed a shot. The army used short rifles, but the scouts were also hunters. Therefore, they used long rifles, which were very accurate. Hawkeye ran out of gunpowder, and he asked Uncas to go to the canoe to get some. Uncas went to the canoe, but to his great disappointment, he saw the Hurons pulling the canoe down the river. They were stranded on that small island, without ammunition and without a canoe. The only possible solution was for Hawkeye and the Mohicans to swim up the river and get help from General Monroe. It was decided that Major Hayward would stay to protect the girls and the wounded preacher, David Gamut. Hawkeye and Chingachgook jumped into the river and began swimming. But Uncas stood near Cora and looked at her.
Your friends are already in the river. Isn't it time for you to follow?
Cora asked.
Uncas will stay to protect you,
The young Mohican said.
Oh no, generous warrior. Go to my father as my confidential messenger. Tell him to trust you. Tell him to free us. This is my wish, Uncas.
The calm, warm look of the young warrior changed to sadness. But he obeyed. With a fast step, he crossed the rocks and jumped into the river. He, Chingachgook, and Hawkeye swam away quietly. They hoped to return to the island to rescue their friends soon. Little did they know of the bad luck that was to follow. Soon after their departure, the Hurons came onto the island. They began to search everywhere. First, they found the rifles that had been left behind. They immediately recognized Hawkeye's long rifle and shouted in French, La longue carabine! La longue carabine! Several Hurons stood around the long hunting rifle and looked at it in amazement. They knew that the owner of the rifle was an extraordinary shot. Major Hayward, David, and the girls were hiding silently in the cave. They heard the shouts of the Hurons coming closer. They sat and waited. Cora embraced Alice, who was terrified. Before long, they were discovered by the Hurons. Magua was their triumphant leader. He had betrayed them all.
Le Renard is my French name, and I am truly clever and cunning like a fox,
said Magua, his eyes shining with satisfaction.
Now you are all prisoners of Le Renard.
He laughed. He took the girls, Major Hayward and David Gamut, prisoners. But he had really wanted to capture Hawkeye and the Mohicans. Magua and the Huron Indians took their prisoners across the river. Then Magua and the 5 warriors went south with the prisoners. The other Hurons went back to the French army camp. 6. Magua's Revenge. Magua led his prisoners through the forest. Late that afternoon, they climbed up a steep hill and made their camp for the night. Magua went to Cora, put his arm on hers, and said,
Listen, you are the daughter of General Monroe. You don't know what your father did to me.
Cora looked at him calmly and tried to hide her fear.
I was born a chief and a warrior among the red Hurons of the lakes. For 20 summers and 20 winters, I had never seen a white man. I was happy in my tribe. Then the white men from Canada came to the forest and taught me to drink firewater. It made me crazy and bad. My tribe sent me away. I lived alone in the forest until the Mohawks took me with them. I then became a Mohawk warrior. The white men have driven the redskins from their hunting grounds. Old General Monroe, your father, was the great captain of our war party. Everyone did what he said. He made a law that if an Indian drinks firewater, he will be punished. I foolishly opened my mouth and drank firewater. Your father discovered me and had me whipped like a dog in front of everyone. Look at these marks on my back. The spirit of a Huron never forgets.
Cora looked nervously at Magua and asked,
Why are you telling me this?
Because I want revenge. I want you to live in my wigwam. I want you to serve me. I want you to be my wife. Then your father will live in torment. This is my revenge. If you become my wife, your sister Alice can return to her father.
Cora stepped back in disgust and said,
You want to live with a wife who doesn't love you and who doesn't belong to your people? It would be smarter to take the rich reward General Monroe will give you if you return his 2 daughters.
No. The daughter of Monroe must get my water, work in my fields, and cook my food. Your father's body will sleep among his cannons, but his heart will lie near my knife. This is my revenge.
Cora was shocked.
I will never be your wife. I would rather die. You are a monster,
she shouted, running away. Magua was furious. He watched Cora as she ran towards the other prisoners.
Then die!
He screamed as he threw his tomahawk at the 2 sisters. It hit a tree above Alice's head. She was petrified. As Major Hayward tried to comfort her, another Huron attacked him. The Indian wanted to kill the Major with a knife. At that instant, a shot from a rifle killed the Indian. Hawkeye and the Mohicans had returned. They attacked the Hurons by surprise. They were able to kill them all, except for Magua, who escaped. 7. Fort Henry. The group was again together. Cora embraced her frightened sister, and Uncas helped them both. After a while, they began their trip to Fort Henry. When it was too dark to travel in the forest, they decided to spend the night in an abandoned hut. Chingachgook stood guard while the others slept. Early the next morning, they continued their trip. To avoid leaving their footprints, they walked barefoot along the stream. Then they climbed a hill from where they could finally see Fort Henry. What a spectacle they saw! The fort was surrounded by General Montcalm's French and Indian forces. How could they possibly reach the fort? At this time, nature became a precious friend. A thick blanket of fog was quickly coming down the lake towards Fort Henry. The fog would hide them as they reached the fort. Hawkeye led the group carefully through General Montcalm's forces. They were so close to the enemy that they could hear them speaking French and Huron. Suddenly, they heard a man's voice speaking English. It was General Monroe, the girl's father. The fort was next to them. Alice called out,
Father, Father, it is I, Alice. Save your daughters.
He immediately recognized his younger daughter's voice, and he ordered his soldiers to open the gates. Tears ran down his pale cheeks as he exclaimed,
For this I thank you, God.
General Monroe was delighted to see his daughters. Cora and Alice were overjoyed to be with their father. He was their only living relative. They had so many things to tell each other. The group was finally able to eat a good meal and to sleep in safety. However, the military situation at Fort Henry was critical. General Montcalm's forces were much more numerous than General Monroe's. General Monroe couldn't understand why General Webb was not helping him. He decided to send Hawkeye to Fort Edward to ask General Webb for help. Hawkeye returned after a few days and said,
I was able to talk to General Webb, and I explained the desperate situation at our fort. He wrote you an important letter, General, which I carried in my pouch. But on my way here, I was captured by the French, and they took the letter. I bring a message from General Montcalm. He wishes to meet you.
General Monroe had no choice. He was surrounded by the enemy. He had little food, and he had few soldiers to defend the fort. He decided to accept the French general's invitation. Exercise 3. A journalist from the Frontier Gazette is visiting Fort Henry and interviews Cora and Alice Munro.
Where do you girls come from?
We both come from New York, but I was born in the West Indies. I was born in Scotland.
How would you describe yourselves?
Well, I'm tall, and I have long black hair and brown eyes. I look like my mother. I'm 23 years old, and my birthday is in August. I'm of medium height, and I have blonde hair and blue eyes. I look like my father. I'm 17 years old, and I was born in January.
How was your trip from New York to Fort Henry?
Oh, it was very exciting. We took a boat up the Hudson River for the first part of the trip. Then we rode in a wagon for several miles until we reached Fort Edward. From Fort Edward, we each rode a horse, and then a canoe to get to Fort Henry.
What surprised you most about Fort Henry?
Well, the fact that it is completely isolated in the wilderness. There are no roads, no people, no other houses nearby. Yes, I agree.
What do you like most about living here?
I like the silence and the beauty of the forest.
What do you like least about living here?
I'm always afraid of an Indian attack. There are very few whites and so many Indians.
What are your future plans?
I'd like to live at the fort and start teaching the children to read and write. Indian children could attend my school too. I definitely want to return to New York, where I have my friends and my comfortable home.
8. General Monroe's story. General Monroe called Major Hayward to his office and said,
General Montcalm wants to meet me, and I have decided to accept. Since you speak French, will you come with me to this meeting?
It will be a pleasure, General.
Major Hayward replied. Then, with great hesitation, Hayward said,
General Monroe, I have something very important to ask you.
Speak up, young man.
With your permission, I would like to marry your daughter Alice, sir.
My daughter Alice?
Exclaimed the general.
You want to unite our two families? But do you know the sad story of our family? You should know it before you make such a decision. Sit down. Let me tell you. When I was a young man like you, I lived in Scotland. I was poor, although my family was honorable. I loved and wanted to marry Alice Graham, the only child of a wealthy landowner. I couldn't marry her because I was poor. Therefore, I joined the army of the king and traveled to the West Indies. There I met a beautiful young girl who became my wife. She was the daughter of a gentleman of those islands. Her mother, though, was a slave and servant. I didn't care about this. I was proud to marry her. She then became Cora's mother. Some people consider these people of the West Indies inferior to us. You certainly know this. When Cora's mother died, I was heartbroken. I returned to Scotland with little Cora. After 20 long years, I again met Alice Graham, my first love. She had waited for me to return. We got married, and Alice was born. Unfortunately, she died shortly after Alice's birth. Cora has been like a mother to Alice. Now you know the truth.
What a touching story,
said Major Hayward, with tears in his eyes. After a moment of silence, General Monroe asked,
Do you still want to mix your family blood with mine? Do you still want to call me father?
Nothing in the world can change my love for Alice. Nothing. Yes, I wish to marry her.
Hayward answered with determination. 9. August 9th, 1757. General Monroe, the major, and a few other soldiers were ready to leave the fort to meet General Montcalm. A soldier carrying a peace flag left the fort before them to announce the arrival of General Monroe. General Montcalm was in his tent. There were French soldiers and Indians everywhere. Magua was there too. Montcalm received his Anglo-American guests with respect. He spoke French, and Major Hayward translated everything into English. The French general seemed sincere. He told Monroe that the Anglo-American position was very weak, and that there was no hope. He showed Monroe the letter that General Webb had written to him. Monroe read the letter several times. Webb wrote that he could not help him in any way. He advised Monroe to surrender. Montcalm admired Monroe's courage and honesty. He respected Monroe's long years of service in the King's army. He offered Monroe and his forces these generous surrender terms. The Anglo-Americans must leave Fort Henry, but they could keep their lives, their flag, their weapons, and their honor as soldiers. As Monroe listened to the terms, his head dropped to his chest. He was immensely disappointed and sad. He and his forces had been defeated. He had no choice. He was responsible for the lives of the people at the fort. After a long silence, he accepted Montcalm's surrender terms. He promised to leave Fort Henry the next morning, and the French general promised not to attack the Anglo-Americans. A peace treaty was then signed. It was August 9th, 1757. A day of victory for the French, but a day of defeat for the Anglo-Americans. It was a day of anger for Magua, who did not want peace. That night he spoke to all the other Huron chiefs, saying,
There is no peace for us Indians. The peace is for the white men. We must have our revenge. I want the scalps of the English. I want revenge for what General Monroe did to me in front of everyone. A Huron never forgets.
10. The Massacre. The following morning, everyone was ready to abandon Fort Henry. There had been very little time to prepare for this journey. Soldiers, women, and children, with their horses, wagons, and few belongings, formed a long line at the gate. There was sadness in the faces of the soldiers and the women. The children were frightened and confused. Major Hayward led the group out of the fort. No one could imagine what was going to happen. The defeated group had just started its long journey home when a loud Indian war cry was heard. Magua was leading the Huron warriors, who savagely started attacking everyone. The French forces saw what was happening, but they did not try to stop the attack. Cries of horror filled the air. One Huron grabbed a baby from its mother's arms and threw it against a rock. The baby screamed with pain and died. Then the Huron raised his tomahawk and split the mother's head. This horrible scene was repeated many times. Men, women, and children were brutally killed and scalped. Then the Hurons drank their blood. Warriors galloped wildly in circles, killing, scalping, and taking the few belongings that were in the wagons. There was mercy for no one. It was a massacre. Years later, historians called this scene of blood and violence the Massacre of Fort Henry. Over 1,000 innocent people were massacred here. Cora, Alice, and David Gamut were taken prisoner by Magua, who led them north into French territory. 3 days after the terrible massacre, General Monroe, Major Hayward, Hawkeye, and the 2 Mohicans returned to the battleground. It was a shocking scene. Hundreds of scalped bodies of men, women, and children lay everywhere. The 5 men searched the dead bodies. They could not find their friends. But they found a piece of Cora's green scarf and David Gamut's pipe. Uncas discovered Magua's footprints next to those of the girls and David Gamut. General Monroe examined the smaller footprints carefully and agreed that they belonged to his daughters.
Let us follow these footprints, and we will find the prisoners. This trail leads north. We must go north,
said Major Hayward. They traveled up Lake Hurricane by canoe. The lake had many small islands, and they traveled close to them for cover. As they passed an island on Lake Hurricane, they were seen by the Hurons. The Hurons jumped into their war canoes and began following them. Suddenly, another Huron war canoe appeared in front of them. Hawkeye told Uncas to change direction. Another small island separated them from the Hurons. The Mohicans paddled as fast as they could, and soon they were ahead of the 3rd Huron canoe. The Hurons shot at them with rifles and arrows, but missed them. Hawkeye shot back at the Hurons with his long rifle and killed one of them. At this point, the Hurons stopped their canoes and returned to their camp. The Mohicans and the other men continued their trip up the lake to the northern end. Then, to trick the enemy, they paddled to the east. After a while, they lifted the canoe out of the water and carried it on their shoulders. They left their footprints everywhere to confuse the enemy. At a certain point, they stopped and walked backwards in their footprints. Then they put the canoe back on the lake. At night, they moved to the western shore of the lake and hid the canoe in the bushes near the shore. They then continued traveling north into the forest. They were now in enemy territory, and their lives were in great danger. Each man was careful not to leave footprints that the enemy could follow. After a few miles, Uncas discovered Magua's footprints again. They were moving in the right direction. 11. The French Juggler. Major Hayward, who led the group, came to a large clearing. In the distance, he thought he saw an Indian village, and a strange Indian walking towards him. He called Hawkeye, who looked and then laughed.
Major, that certainly isn't an Indian village. It's a beaver colony,
he exclaimed.
And look, it's David Gamut, not an Indian. David, what are you doing here? Where are the girls?
Hawkeye asked. Magua captured me and the girls during the massacre. Alice is now a prisoner in a Huron village, 2 miles from here. Cora was sent to a Delaware village nearby. Since I was always singing my church hymns, the Hurons thought I was mad. The Indian tradition respects mad people and lets them go, do whatever they want. That's why I am here and free to move about.
If you're free to move about, then you can really help us, David,
said Hawkeye.
You can easily go to the Huron village and tell Alice that we are here to help her and Cora escape. No one will suspect you.
I'll go with you, David. It will be easier to save Alice if there are 2 of us,
Major Hayward exclaimed.
I have an idea. Chingachgook has lots of paints, and he can make me look like a French juggler from Ticonderoga. You know, there are jugglers and clowns who go from village to village. I speak French perfectly, and the paints will change my appearance.
Chingachgook painted Major Hayward's face, and soon he was ready to begin his adventure as a French juggler in the Huron village. Hawkeye and Uncas decided to explore the area around the Indian villages, while Chingachgook and General Monroe remained at the beaver colony. As soon as Major Hayward, disguised as a French juggler, entered the Huron village, he was surrounded by curious children. They looked at him, ran around him, and touched him. Although his disguise was excellent, Hayward was nervous. He looked for the biggest wigwam of the village and quietly entered. It was full of Huron Indians, all seated in a circle. Some were talking. Others were smoking a long pipe. He sat down with them. One of the older warriors, probably the chief, spoke to him in French. "Where are you from, white brother?"
I come from the French fort of Ticonderoga. I am a juggler, a man of magic,
Hayward replied in French. "An evil spirit lives in my daughter. You are a juggler, a man of magic. Can you frighten the evil spirit away with your magic?" Hayward knew something about the Indian beliefs and superstitions. He thought this was a good opportunity for him to move around in the village. Perhaps he could find Alice. He answered the Indian in a mysterious way.
All spirits are different. Some can be frightened away, but others are too strong. However, I will try.
"You will try?" asked the older warrior. Hayward nodded. "Then let us go to the cave," said the older warrior. 12. The Spirit of the Cave. A loud shout came from the nearby forest. The entire village went to see what was happening. A Huron war party had just returned with several scalps and a prisoner. The prisoner was Uncas. Magua led him into a wigwam and put warriors all around to guard him. Magua walked proudly through the village because he had finally captured his great enemy. He told the Hurons that Uncas was a Mohican chief and their enemy. They decided to torture and then kill him the following day. Uncas was tied to a post in the wigwam. He was not afraid of his enemy, who insulted and tormented him. He was a Mohican warrior, the son of a chief. Everyone knew of his courage, strength, and honesty. He had always lived like a warrior, and now he would die like one. The older warrior took the disguised Hayward outside the village, to the cave where the sick woman was. The Indians believed that a cave, with its walls of rock, would protect the woman from the evil spirit that had possessed her. As they reached the cave, Hayward noticed that a big brown bear had been following him. He didn't worry, because he knew that Indians often kept tame bears in their villages. The sick woman was lying on a bearskin in the dark cave. Lots of Huron women stood around her. Hayward told all the women to leave him alone with her. The squaws left slowly and quietly, because they had great respect for men of magic. Hayward looked carefully at the young woman who gave no signs of life. She was very ill. Unfortunately, she was dying, and Hayward could do nothing to help her. The big bear had followed Hayward to the cave. It began to growl and to move around. Hayward didn't know what to do with the bear. Suddenly, the bear started laughing. It took its head off, and it was Hawkeye. Exercise 4. Listen to this interview with Chief Chingachgook, and then, with a partner, fill in the blank spaces. A journalist from the Frontier Gazette is interviewing Chief Chingachgook.
How old are you, Chief Chingachgook?
I have seen 63 summers and 63 winters.
Who are your people?
My people are the Mohicans, the people of the turtle. We were numerous and strong before the palefaces came.
What happened when the white men came?
The palefaces started cutting the trees in our forests to make houses and forts. The animals of the forest ran away. Our people had to move away, always farther away. The palefaces took our land and our hunting grounds and gave us nothing.
Did the white settlers bring you anything?
The settlers brought us war, death, sickness, and fire water. These things killed our people, who were once strong and healthy. Fire water made our men crazy.
How do you see the future?
There is sun and light in the future of the white settlers, but there is only darkness in the future of the Indians.
Why do you say this?
My eyes have seen too many things. In the spring of my life, when I was a young warrior, my people ruled this land. They were happy, strong, and healthy. We lived in peace with nature. Now, in the winter of my life, the white men rule my world. My people have disappeared. This beautiful world is no longer ours.
13. Alice escapes. Hayward couldn't believe his eyes.
Hawkeye! What are you doing here dressed as a bear?
Hawkeye replied, smiling.
When I was in the forest, I saw a Huron medicine man dressing up as a bear. I killed the medicine man and took his place as a bear. This is the perfect disguise. Do you know that I found Alice?
You did? Where is she?
Hayward cried.
She's in the next cave. She's tied to a post.
Hayward immediately ran to the next cave and untied her. She was trembling and could barely stand up.
My dearest Alice!
Hayward cried, embracing her.
Duncan, I knew that you would never desert me.
Alice exclaimed, her voice trembling.
We must get out of here now,
Hayward said. But just as he took Alice's hand, Magua surprised them from behind. He laughed in his evil way, but before he could finish laughing, the bear grabbed Magua and threw him to the ground. He began to tie him with long strings of buckskin. First he tied his arms behind his back. Then he tied his legs together tightly. At last he gagged Magua's mouth. He left him on the ground in the cave. Magua was powerless. Hawkeye then turned to Alice and Hayward.
Alice, if you want to escape from here, put on the clothes of the sick woman and keep your face covered. Duncan, you carry her in your arms. Tell the Indians outside that you're taking the woman to the forest to eat special herbs. Let's go now.
Hayward, with Alice in his arms, and the bear, walked out of the cave, and they found a crowd of Indians. The father and the husband of the sick woman asked Hayward where he was taking her.
I have driven away the evil spirit. It is now shut in the cave. No one must enter the cave until sunrise. I am taking the woman to the forest to eat special herbs that will make her strong. She will return to her wigwam at sunrise.
The father and the husband were satisfied with Hayward's explanation, and let them go into the forest. As soon as they had entered the forest, Hawkeye said,
At this point, my friends, I must leave you. Uncas is still a prisoner of the Hurons, and I cannot leave him here alone. We've lived together and fought together for many years. I want to try to save him.
Thank you for your precious help, Hawkeye,
said Hayward, smiling.
There is very little time, Hayward. Take Alice along the northern bank until you come to a waterfall. Then climb the hill on your right, and you'll see the village of the Delaware Indians. There you will both be safe. The Delawares are related to the Mohicans, and they will help you.
Hayward and Alice began their journey through the forest, while Hawkeye, still dressed as a bear, returned to the Huron village. 14. Hawkeye saves Uncas. Uncas was inside a dark wigwam, tied to a pole. Some Huron warriors guarded the entrance to the wigwam. He had been tormented and humiliated by the warriors. At sunrise he would be tortured and killed. The hatred between the two tribes was immense. Hawkeye, still disguised as a bear, returned to the village. There he met David Gamut and explained the reason for his disguise. David was very surprised, but willing to help. Hawkeye told him about his plan to rescue Uncas. Since David was considered mad by the Hurons, he was free to go where he wanted in the village. David and the bear went to the wigwam where Uncas was kept prisoner. Warriors stood outside guarding the wigwam. David spoke to one of the warriors who understood a little English. He told him that since he was mad, he had certain magic powers that could make Uncas as weak and cowardly as a Delaware squaw. Becoming weak and cowardly was the worst humiliation for any Indian warrior. It was far better to die a terrible death. The warrior told the others about David's magic powers and about his cruel idea. They were amused and agreed that this spell would destroy Uncas's reputation. David entered the wigwam and the bear followed. The bear immediately went to Uncas and identified himself. Uncas was glad to see his faithful friend Hawkeye. While Hawkeye freed Uncas, he quickly explained his escape plan. He took off his bear skin and gave it to Uncas. Uncas was now the bear. David, instead, gave Hawkeye his clothes, hat, glasses, and prayer book. Hawkeye was now disguised as the preacher. David agreed to take Uncas's place and be the prisoner for a short time until the Hurons discovered the truth. The Hurons would never hurt a mad person, so David was safe. Hawkeye and Uncas were on their way to the Delaware village, where they would find their friends. 15. Magua declares war. At the Huron village, the real identity of the prisoner in the wigwam had been discovered. The warriors who guarded the wigwam were furious because their prisoner had escaped, and they had been tricked. Shouts and cries of revenge filled the air. Fortunately, the Hurons didn't hurt David Gamut. However, he was worried when he realized what was happening in the village. The father and husband of the sick woman entered the cave to fight off the evil spirit that was shut inside. Instead of the evil spirit, they found her dead body. They understood that they had been tricked, and they, too, were furious. A few moments after their sad discovery, other warriors found Magua, still tied and lying in the other cave. Magua's anger was beyond description. He had lost his prized prisoner, and he had been tricked and humiliated by his enemies. He shrieked like a wounded animal. He desperately wanted revenge. Magua called a meeting of all the warriors, elders, and chiefs. It was a war council. Magua had always been a good speaker and a leader of the tribe. He openly declared war on those who had tricked his people. The war preparations began. Runners were sent in all directions. Spies were ordered to approach the Delaware village. Warriors were told to meet before sunrise. Women and children were told to hide in their wigwams. The next morning, well before sunrise, Magua wore his deerskin robe with the design of a fox, his symbol or totem. The war party was ready to leave. They silently followed Magua in a straight line that today is called Indian File. As the sun began to rise, they crossed the beaver colony. The warriors saw a few beavers moving about and considered this a good omen. They did not suspect that Chingachgook was hiding in the beaver colony and spying their movements. It was morning when the Huron warriors arrived in the Delaware village. The morning sun lit up the beautiful summer colors of the forest and the village. The air was fresh, and the sky was a clear blue. The Hurons and the Delawares were both friends of the French. The Delawares, however, had not taken part in General Montcalm's campaign. In the past, the Delawares had been close friends with the Mohicans. 16. The Delaware Chief. Magua's war party was welcomed by the Delaware chief, who said,
"The wise Huron is welcome. He has come to eat his succotash with his brothers of the lakes."
Magua bent his head with respect in front of the Delaware chief. The chief invited Magua to enter his wigwam and share his morning meal. During the meal, the two discussed Magua's recent hunt. The cunning Huron avoided talking about the real reason of his visit. After the meal, the squaws came to remove their gourds. Magua now began to reveal the real reason of his visit.
"How is my prisoner?"
he asked, referring to Cora.
"She is well,"
answered the Delaware chief.
"Does my prisoner give you trouble?"
he continued.
"No, she is welcome here,"
the chief said. Magua wanted Cora back, but he didn't want to say so.
"Have there been white men in the forest recently?"
Magua insisted. The chief now understood what Magua really wanted. The Delawares had helped Hawkeye, Major Hayward, and Alice. But this was a secret. They always protected their guests. In his heart, the Delaware chief did not like Magua. Magua felt that he was not liked. Therefore he opened his pouch and gave trinkets as gifts to the chief and his men. These were the same trinkets that had been taken from the dead bodies of the victims at the massacre of Fort Henry. Magua's cunning move was appreciated by the Delawares, but they still said nothing about the guests they were hiding in their village. Magua became impatient and said,
"I have come to take back my prisoners, Cora Munro, and the others you are hiding here."
He had just finished speaking when a strange, old figure appeared in front of everyone. There was whispering in the crowd. Exercise 2. Listen to the following information about the Indian tribes you have read about in this book. Then fill in the table with the correct information. After, look at the map and see if you can locate the states where the Indians are living today.
In the last of the Mohicans, we have read about several Indian tribes: the Mohicans, the Mohawks, the Hurons, the Delawares. What happened to them through the years? And what happened to the tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy? The Mohawks. Most of the 1,500 Mohawks today live on the Grand River Reserve, near the east end of Lake Ontario. The Hurons. Today, about 1,250 Hurons live on reservations in Ohio, Kansas, and Ontario, Canada. The Delawares. About 2,000 Delawares live in the state of Oklahoma. The Oneidas. Today, 4,100 Oneidas live on the Oneida Reservation in New York and in northern Wisconsin. The Onondagas. About 1,400 Onondagas still live in Onondaga County, New York. The Cayugas. There are about 550 Cayugas in Oklahoma and 400 in New York. The Senecas. This is the most numerous group, with 7,000 Senecas in New York, Ontario, and Pennsylvania, and 850 in Oklahoma.
17. Tamenund. An old figure slowly approached the crowd. He walked with the help of 2 warriors. His face was dark and wrinkled. His hair was long and white. He wore a long headdress of colored feathers. His robe was of the finest buckskin. Around his neck he wore big silver and gold medals. These were gifts from white men he had met in the past. The handle of his tomahawk was made of gold. This was Tamenund, the venerated chief of the tribe, who was sacred to his people. He was the father of the Delaware nation. He was over 100 years old, and very wise and just. Tamenund knew about Cora and the other guests in his village. He spoke in a firm voice.
Bring the prisoner and the guests before me.
The prisoners and guests lined up before Tamenund. He looked at them carefully. Then he said,
Magua, you can take Cora Monroe because you asked us to take care of her. Now you can have her back. But the others came to our village freely. They are our guests. Guests here are protected.
But they are our enemies. They are all enemies of your friends, the French. And so they are your enemies too,
shouted Magua. Alice, Cora, and Major Hayward stood together wondering what would happen to them. Hawkeye and Uncas were in the crowd, trying to decide what to do. Suddenly, Uncas stepped out of the crowd and went to Tamenund. In front of Tamenund, Uncas took off his shirt so that everyone could see the tattoo of a turtle on his chest. The crowd of Delaware shouted with happiness and surprise when they saw the tattoo. They, too, were people of the turtle. They knew that only the greatest chiefs could wear this tattoo.
Wise Father Tamenund, I am Uncas, son of Chingachgook. I am the last of the Mohicans. I am one of the people of the turtle. The Mohicans and the Delawares have been true brothers for many years. I ask for your help against the Hurons.
Tamenund was influenced by Uncas's sincere words. He turned to Magua and said,
Go, and take the girl with you. But only the girl. The others stay here. When the sun is well above the trees, the Delaware warriors will be after you.
Cora knew the time had come to leave her sister. She looked at Major Hayward with tears in her eyes and said,
I know you love Alice, and I beg of you to protect her always.
Major Hayward held Alice's fragile hand, but couldn't speak.
Alice, let us embrace, perhaps for the last time,
said Cora, her voice trembling. Alice was barely able to stand on her feet and leaned against Major Hayward. She couldn't believe that she and Cora were separating. The 2 sisters embraced. Suddenly, Magua pulled Cora by the arm and led her away into the forest. 18. Uncas's battle cry. Uncas, who liked Cora very much, was thinking about how to rescue her. He and other older warriors gathered around a traditional Indian post painted with dark red stripes. They began to do a war dance and danced around the post. Their faces were painted with war paint. Uncas sang an ancient prayer to the Great Spirit, Manito, asking for strength and courage. At the end of the prayer, he threw his tomahawk into the post. Then he raised his voice in a fierce shout, which was his battle cry. The battle cry was heard all through the Delaware village, and it was the signal of war. More than 200 young warriors ran to the post. They too began dancing the war dance and throwing their tomahawks into the post. War on the Hurons had been declared. Uncas kept his eyes on the position of the sun, which was reaching its high point in the sky. It was time to follow Magua, rescue Cora, and attack the Hurons. The Delawares were divided into 2 war parties. Uncas led the main party to attack the Huron village. Hawkeye and Major Hayward led 20 warriors to the beaver colony, where Chingachgook and General Monroe were waiting. Hawkeye's group would attack from behind to surprise the Hurons. The 2 war parties left the Delaware village and entered the forest that separated them from the Hurons. They moved silently and quickly. The only sound in the forest was the wind. As they approached the Huron village, Hawkeye heard footsteps coming from the bushes. He immediately pointed his rifle at the bushes, but then he saw David Gamut's friendly face. David was amazed to see an Indian war party approaching. He told Hawkeye that he had just escaped from the Hurons and was seeking help.
Help?
Asked Hawkeye.
We've declared war on the Hurons, and we must rescue Cora. We need help, David. Come with us.
David joined the group and said, I saw Magua taking Cora into a cave in the mountain. I think he left her there.
He left her in a cave?
Interrupted Major Hayward.
Then we can surely rescue her.
I'll take about 20 men and attack from behind the village,
said Hawkeye.
Uncas, you and your warriors will attack from the front. In the middle of the confusion, we'll go to the cave and rescue Cora.
19. The final battle. The fighting began in the forest and spread out to the village. It became a fierce battle. The warriors of both tribes were well prepared for war. There was shooting and hand-to-hand combat. Knives and tomahawks were covered with blood. Arrows flew in every direction. The warriors threw themselves at each other with all the strength and energy of their young bodies. This was the moment to rescue Cora. Uncas, Hawkeye, Hayward, and Gamut climbed to the caves in the mountain. In the distance, Uncas saw Magua with 2 warriors, leading Cora from the cave to the hillside.
It's Cora! Cora!
Exclaimed Uncas as he and the others moved quickly up the hillside. The Hurons couldn't move as quickly because Cora was exhausted and could barely walk.
I will go no farther,
cried Cora.
Kill me if you want, you savage. I will go no farther.
The other 2 warriors raised their tomahawks ready to strike at her, but Magua stopped them. He took his knife and turned to Cora with a look of fierce passion and said,
Woman, choose either the wigwam or the knife of Magua.
Cora didn't look at him. She dropped down on her knees, raised her eyes, and lifted her arms towards the sky. Then she weakly said,
Do with me as you think best.
Magua became very impatient and repeated,
Woman, choose.
But Cora did not seem to hear him. Magua, trembling with anger, raised his knife, but then hesitated again. Once more he struggled with himself and lifted his knife to strike Cora. Just then Uncas appeared, jumping down from a rock above. Magua moved back to avoid him. In that instant, one of Magua's warriors took out his knife and stabbed Cora in the heart. She fell at Magua's feet. Magua was about to kill his own warrior, but Uncas jumped on him, and a long, fiery fight began. Magua wounded Uncas with his knife. Although Uncas was severely wounded, he was able to kill Cora's murderer. Then he fell to the ground, looking at Magua straight in the eyes. The Mohican's strength was leaving his body, but his courage was greater than ever. He turned to Magua and looked at him with disgust, as Magua stabbed him in the heart 3 times. The Mohican was dead. And near him lay Cora.
Mercy! Mercy, Huron!
Cried Major Hayward, who had seen the horror. Magua waved his bloody knife in the air and then leapt across a deep precipice. He hoped to reach the other side of the cliff, where no one could reach him. But his leap was too short. He grabbed a bush on the other side of the precipice. He desperately tried to climb up onto the ledge. Hawkeye was watching everything from the opposite side of the precipice. He took his rifle, killdeer, took aim, and fired. The bullet hit Magua, who fell to his death in the precipice. Le Renard was dead. 20. The Last Mohican. The next morning there was silence and destruction in the Huron village. They had been defeated. The Delawares, who had won the battle, were equally silent and sad. There were no songs of triumph or shouts of success. Everyone in the village mourned Uncas and Cora, the two young friends who had shared a tragic destiny. The entire Delaware village formed a circle around their bodies. 6 Indian girls covered Cora's body with an Indian robe, and sweet herbs and forest flowers. They sang in honor of the dead. Their song said that Cora and Uncas would be together in the happy hunting grounds. Cora's beauty had a serene quality. Old General Monroe sat at Cora's feet and cried desperately. Alice, Hayward, Hawkeye, and David Gamut crowded together in silent grief. On the opposite side of the area, there was Uncas's body. He was seated, as in life, covered with beautiful ornaments, medals, and bracelets. Colorful feathers were placed on his head. Chingachgook sat beside Uncas, looking at the young warrior, and probably remembering their happy times together. One by one, the Delaware warriors spoke about Uncas, his courage, his strength, and his honesty. He had been an example for them. A signal was given by one of the older chiefs to the girls. Obeying the signal, the girls began to sing, raised the bier, and carried it to the grave under some young pine trees. Here Cora was buried in the brown earth. General Monroe stood by Cora's grave and said,
"The being that we all worship under different names will remember your kindness, and one day we will all meet around his throne, without distinction of color, class, or sex."
David Gamut read several prayers from his prayer book, and then stood silently by Cora's grave. General Monroe and the other whites slowly left the village. Hawkeye remained with the Indians. Chingachgook stood up and spoke to the tribe, saying,
Do not mourn. Do not cry. Uncas was a good son. He was courageous. Who can deny it? Uncas has gone to the happy hunting grounds. The Great Spirit needed such a warrior and called him away. I am alone now. My race has gone from the shores of the Big Salt Lake and the hills of the Delawares. I am like an old pine tree in a clearing of pale faces. I am alone. I am the last of the Mohicans.
"No, no!"
cried Hawkeye.
"God has given us different colors, but I'm your blood brother. I'll never forget your son, Uncas. We fought together in many wars. We hunted together in the great forest, and we shared our meals in peace. You are not alone. I will stay with you now, Chingachgook.
Chingachgook and Hawkeye shook hands over the fresh earth that covered Uncas's grave. Tears ran down their cheeks. Tamenund came to close the ceremony.
My life has been too long. When I was young, the people of the turtle ruled the world. They were happy and strong. Now, the palefaces are the masters of the earth. I have lived to see the last warrior of the wise race of the Mohicans.
Exercise 3. Listen to the information about the Iroquois Constitution and answer the questions.
The famous Iroquois Constitution was probably created during the 15th century. This constitution was the basis for the Iroquois Confederacy, or Iroquois League. The political system of the Iroquois people has been a model for all forms of representative governments, or democracies, including the United States government. Here are some parts of the Iroquois Constitution that clearly show the wisdom and justice of these people. I am Dekanawida, and with the 5 nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Cayuga, Onondaga, Seneca, I plant the tree of the great peace. We place at the top of the tree an eagle who is able to see far. If he sees any evil approaching or any danger threatening, he will at once warn the people of the Confederacy. We will offer thanks to the earth where men live, to the streams of water, the springs and the lakes. Thanks to the maize, the fruits, the medicinal herbs and trees. Thanks to the forest trees for their usefulness, to the animals that serve as food and give their skins for clothing. Thanks to the winds, the rains, the sun, the moon, to all the messengers of the great Creator who lives in the heavens above, who gives all the things useful to men, and who is the source and the ruler of health and life. The 50 sachems, rulers, or made peace chiefs will be chosen by the Iroquois women. These sachems will be crowned with the deer's antlers. A sachem must be a mentor of the people of the Confederacy. He must not indulge in anger, offensive actions, and criticism. In his heart there will be peace and good. His mind will be filled with welfare for the people of the Confederacy. Self-interest must be thrown aside forever. Look and listen for the welfare of the people, and always remember not only the present, but also the future generations, the unborn nation.